Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa for our Sudanese special. Sudanese demonstrators vow to remain on the streets, calling for regime change, even after the army ousts Omar al-Bashir. After 4 months of rallies, his 30-year rule comes to an abrupt end as he's arrested, but the military's plan to run the country for 2 years before elections is a far cry from protesters' calls for a new civilian leadership. Now, after 30 years in power, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir has been overthrown by the military. It comes after months of deadly protests over his repressive rule. On Thursday, Defense Minister Awad Mohamed Ahmad Ibn Auf announced that Bashir had been arrested. A military council will now be formed and it will rule for 2 years before elections take place. The constitution's been suspended, the government dissolved, a 3-month state of emergency and curfew brought in. Although all political detainees have been freed, the opposition's called the takeover a dangerous move, and protesters say the army's plan is little more than moving around the deck chairs, and they've vowed to keep up a huge sit-in around the defense ministry.
Nothing has changed. There's nothing new. We were demanding the complete change of the regime and government, but they just replaced one guy with another. We're calling for someone, a son of Sudan, to re-establish this country and this ruined economy and infrastructure. But they did nothing for us, so we're staying in the streets.
This regime is trying to fool the Sudanese people by changing its skin. The deep state's plan is to remove the head and put him in a safe place and not even show the people that he's in detention.
The Sudanese people are aware. They understand what's going on. They don't just want a change of faces. We don't need Defense Minister Ibn Auf. This will not work with us.
Well, Rima Shawkat's a journalist and presenter. She joins us now from Khartoum. Rima, thanks very much for speaking to us. Now, first of all, it's been an emotional day going from joy to anger for protesters. Tell us a little bit more about that journey, why so many protesters are not happy by seeing the back of al-Bashir after protesting for 4 months.
People have been on the streets for 4 months right now, and they were expecting so much more. I mean, the military establishment in Sudan is very deeply embedded, so I think any kind of regime change was going to have the military in place at the time. But then people were waiting the whole day for the statement for, they were waiting for about 10 hours for the statement. So they expected the statement at least to be, to acknowledge what has been happening in a proper way. They expected it to acknowledge the civilian government, and they expected that a better alternative was going to be proposed. 2 years again of a military dictatorship is not what people have died for. It's not what people have been struggling for the last 4 months. In the beginning, in the early morning, people were happy. People were crying. They were laughing. They were very happy. They were on the street celebrating because the news is that Bashir was gone. Okay, so after 30 years of his rule, it was finally over for him. But then after the statement, people were frustrated because this is not what they asked for. They asked for something so much bigger, and this is why I just came back from the army HQ.
No, please continue, Rima.
Yes, I just came back from the army headquarters, and there's a lot of people are there. People are back. They're not leaving. They're not leaving the sit-in. They are going to spend the night, and they're going to continue protesting until their demand is met. This is not the end for the Sudan uprising.
So why don't you have faith in the military's plan?
Because the military, I mean, with Bashir, the elections was going to supposedly happen next year. The military wants to stay in power, so this new committee wants power for 2 years, okay, which is a very long time, okay? What we want is a civilian democracy, okay? And even during the 2 years, they want a state of emergency for 3 months. They want to impose curfew. They want to dissolve the parliament. They want basically no institutions to be functioning. And for us to have a democracy, we need to have the space to actually build institutions, to build a vibrant civil society, to have a real democracy. And this 2 years, we're not going to be able to do that. It's going to be the civic space is going to be very, very, very bad, just like before. This is the first thing. The second thing is Ibn Auf is Bashir's guy, and this is basically the regime once again. He's not. It's not a different character. It's not a different regime. It's just not Bashir,
Rima?
but it's just another Bashir, basically.
Rima Shorkat, thanks very much for speaking to us. So the biggest challenge to Omar al-Bashir's 30-year rule began with demonstrations in the northern town of Atbara. That was last December. It came after the price of bread doubled after flour subsidies were slashed. Now, many Sudanese were struggling under austerity measures. The country's ailing economy and public anger led to a wave of protests which quickly spread across the country, including the capital, Khartoum. Now, the focus of marches then turned to Bashir's rule, and as authorities cracked down, dozens of people were killed. Despite Bashir's efforts to sidestep the popular pressure, the rallies continued, and last Saturday began a sit-in around the Defense Ministry, the same complex that housed Bashir's residence. By Thursday, his arrest was announced. Now, Bashir's long been accused of committing crimes against humanity and genocide in Sudan's Darfur region, and he's the subject of an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court. Lutz Oete joins us now with more. Lutz, thanks very much for speaking to us. Now, after 29 years in power for Omar al-Bashir, why is all of this happening now? Why have we seen these last 4 months of protests culminating in his exit after 3 decades in power?
Right. This has been very long in the making because we need to remember that there has been resistance against the regime since the very beginning. And I think we need to credit all those who worked to oppose the dictatorship over the last 3 decades. Now, what accounts for the most recent developments is actually a combination of factors. In 2011, with the separation of South Sudan, what we've seen is a decline in economic revenue, in opportunities, coupled with corruption and mounting repression. And these factors together then brought about rapid dissatisfaction amongst the broader population, which we can now witness on the streets throughout the country.
So what's Bashir's leadership been like?
Well, he's often been credited for being a canny political operator and survivor. But his leadership has left a disastrous legacy for the country. He's embroiled Sudan in a number of armed conflicts characterized by serious international crimes, brought about the Islamization and the oppression of women's rights, a number of human rights violations throughout his regime, growing securitization and security sector that has become increasingly corrupt, and now more recently also economic decline, which then was the trigger for the conflict.
Thanks very much, Lutz Oete there. Now, many Sudanese want to see the whole ideological regime linked to Omar al-Bashir gone. Ibn Auf was a key military leader in Bashir's suppression of rebels in Darfur and is under US sanction in connection to atrocities committed during that conflict. Now, protesters have been angrily pointing out that Bashir and Ibn Auf stand for the same things and say that the army is just trying to replace what they're calling one thief with another. Changes come, but not the way they wanted. Nicolas Chemin tells us more.
Omar al-Bashir has been toppled by a man who was very close to him, Awad ibn Auf, who announced the coup on Sudanese television.
As Defense Minister, I declare the fall of the regime and the placing of its leader in detention following his arrest.
Awad ibn Auf was made defense minister in 2015 and named vice president in February. He played a prominent role in the Darfur conflict, in which some 300,000 people were killed. It began in the western region in 2003 when black Sudanese rebelled against the Arab-dominated government. They said Darfur was marginalized. The US said Awad ibn Auf supported and managed militias accused of carrying out genocide in the region. Washington has blocked his assets since 2007. Omar al-Bashir is wanted by the International Criminal Court on charges of genocide in Darfur. On Thursday, the African Union spokesperson told France 24 it condemned the coup.
The 2000 Lomé Declaration on the Unconstitutional Change of Government and the AU Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, both very strong AU instruments, strongly condemn any unconstitutional change of government, and also these instruments commit member states to the respect of rule of law and constitutional order and human rights.
Ibn Auf announced a 2-year period of military rule. Demonstrators rejected this and vowed to continue their protests. Many said that Ibn Auf and Bashir are two sides of the same coin.
Now, al-Bashir's fall comes just a week after similar protests in Algeria forced the resignation of longtime leader Abdelaziz Bouteflika. The dynamic of these most recent protests on the continent to oust leaders could have repercussions around the region. Tom Gardner joins us now with more. Tom, with all of this coming off the back of the ousting of Bouteflika, is it reasonable to see this as possibly being the beginning of a second-generation Arab Spring?
I mean, it's not unreasonable. You can hear the kind of mantra of the Arab Spring is back. You have people in Algeria saying, chanting for the last month that people want the regime to go, which is basically exactly what has been echoed in Sudan. I mean, they're very clearly echoing each other. You have protesters in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, Palestinian. I mean, so yeah, there is certainly something similar in the air, but it's important to recognize the context is pretty different. You've already had the Arab Spring, which turned pretty sour, so the precedents are worrying, and people are aware of that. In the past, you had foreign sponsors like Turkey, Iran, Qatar, who were helping spread the protest movement. You really don't have that now. I mean, looking at Sudan, I mean, this is very much domestic-led, and it hasn't had much in terms of international foreign backing at all. So, yes, there are similarities, but I mean, it's a kind of different world today, and it's probably too early to call it a second Arab Spring for that reason.
What has the international response been to Bashir's ouster?
Well, the US has said it's going to suspend the second track, the ongoing dialogue with Sudan, dialogue which is ultimately supposed to pave the way for debt relief. That's not insignificant. I mean, you have statements from various EU members of the EU on condemning the violence or condemning the coup, essentially. You have the African Union doing the same, hinting at a suspension of membership of the African Union, because of this unconstitutional change of government. I do think it's somewhat weaker, though, than what the AU has, said in the past with regards to recent coups on the continent. And there's no timeline really they're not sitting on a timeline for the military to step aside. And it's probably worth noting that the chair of the African Union right now is the president of Egypt, al-Sisi, who himself came to power in a coup, and the Egyptian foreign ministry also seems to recognize the new regime.
Thanks very much. Tom Gardner there for us. Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us. Please do so again if you can. Take care.